the opening of Alexander Scriabin's 10th piano sonata. The pianist was this week's guest, Yevgeny Sudbin. I'm James Jolly and welcome to this Gramophone Podcast. Yevgeny Sudbin's new bis recording is not only his 25th of the label, but also marks a return to the music of Scriabin. His first Scriabin recording, released back in 2007, drew from Gramophone's Bryce Morrison the comment that it was a disc in a million. All in all, a good reason to catch up with the pianist to talk about his relationship with the music of this most enigmatic and individual Russian composer. So you've trained in St. Petersburg, then in Berlin, and then in London. Am I right in thinking that attitudes towards Scriabin's music were quite different in, say, Russia to the West?
With Scriabin in Russia, I remember going through quite a lot of different repertoire, and Scriabin was actually quite a small part of the repertoire that I had to go through. So then when I came to Germany, I also played some Scriabin, but I think the way it happened for me with Scriabin is that it's not so much I was looking out for the composer. It was, I feel like the composer found me in a way, because it was always in my repertoire, but I never paid a special attention. I think it was only in London when I started also listening maybe more to Horowitz recordings and playing more Scriabin as well, that I just discovered that I actually really love this composer. So I wouldn't say it was in Russia. I think it happened for me more in London much later, after I've gone through quite a lot of different repertoire. But in terms of attitude in Russia, yes, Russians feel very strongly that it's a Russian composer, but why I find Scriabin so fascinating, and one of the reasons it appeals to me, is I feel it actually lacks any nationalistic identity. Yeah, I mean, the music is kind of universal. There are no sort of elements that you would identify with Russia in my mind.
So if you go forward, as it were, and bump into Scriabin, you just think, well, where did that come from? But actually, it's quite interesting. If you look the other way, you can sort of see the composers who were obviously influenced by Scriabin and the sort of language that, people like Szymanowski, that rich, very kind of perfumed harmonic language.
Yes, and also the fact that it evolved so much. I can think of almost no other composer where the style has actually evolved. Although, and it's interesting, the young Scriabin, you can still tell it's Scriabin, although obviously some people believe it's heavily influenced by Chopin's music. I mean, it is to some extent true, but I can still hear Scriabin in his early style. But then his, of course, the late style has very little in common. It becomes much more almost formulaic. Sort of you have a lot of the pieces are based on this Promethean chord, and so it becomes much darker in some sense and more complicated in other ways. You mentioned Szymanowski, and I would say this is maybe the only other composer I can think of who actually went through a similar path in a sense. I do believe, there was definitely influence. But he is kind of an anomaly. It is hard to understand where such a personality, where it came from, because like I say, there's no nationalistic elements. The early Scriabin, of course, is very romantic, and then just the way it evolved. I mean, he only lived until 43, and just how the style changed, I find it quite sort of incredible. It's really is kind of an anomaly in music. I mean, there are other composers, for example, like Medtner, where Opus 1 is almost exactly like his last opus, but with Scriabin he's always evolving, always searching. But in my mind, I can recognize early Scriabin. That you can still hear. It's very definitely him, not kind of poor imitation of, say, Chopin.
So this is your second Scriabin recording. Your first one came out in 2007, was very well reviewed. And both of them, you've put together a programme that ranges widely over Scriabin's career. The first album, you had three of the sonatas, numbers 2, 5 and 9. Yeah. And then this new one, you have sort of four pillars. So you have two sonatas, you have the fourth and the 10th. Then you have Vers la Flamme, and you also have the Fantasy Opus 28. So they're the sort of larger works. And then in between those, you've got works one might say are sort of slightly Chopinesque because they take the same kind of names. So in a way, you're offering in each of your Scriabin projects a sort of conspectus of the composer's musical output. Is that fair in how you constructed it, a sort of journey in each of them?
Yes, I try to do it actually for every recording. What I try to do is try to show a composer from all possible sides and sort of to show him as diverse as possible, so that not just focus on one period or not on one kind of genre, but to kind of show off a composer from sort of best possible angles, as you would say. I mean, Scriabin doesn't have any bad angles. I would say all the angles are extremely interesting. Yeah, so actually it is fairly easy to construct a program for Scriabin because there is so much variety. I mean, from early to late period, and even within each category, within each period, there's also so much diversity. And it's not only to show off the composer from sort of different epochs, but also how the pieces connect emotionally, structurally, and sort of harmonically as well, to try and have as many different styles as possible. So as you say, the first recording was like this. I think maybe the first recording, I can't remember now, but I did it kind of more or less chronologically. On this recording, it's not so much the case. I focused more maybe on how the pieces connect to each other. And in a way, finishing with the prelude and nocturne for the left hand, it kind of comes almost like full circle. So my focus was more on showing him off more from sort of different musical sides, and not necessarily because I assume people know that he went through such crazy transformation throughout his life.
He's one of those composers where when people talk about his music, they often reach for non-musical analogies. So they talk about perfume or they talk about light, which is a kind of appropriate for a composer who was very sensitive to synesthesia. So he had colours that he could see related to sounds. Even in your notes, you reach for words like luminous, and you're talking about light a lot of the time. I mean, do you feel these sort of analogous emotionals or sensory reception, I guess?
Yes, but he does it in a way the other way around. Through music, he's trying to evoke all these senses in people. And I mean, this is what I find so fascinating and unique about Scriabin, is that he kind of goes deep down to the essence of human existence, and not even human existence, but maybe the existence
cosmic
of the
existence.
Cosmic existence. Yes, he kind of deconstructs this down to atomic levels, but not physical level, but maybe more sort of emotional level, something we cannot express with words. And if you read his biographies, you will see that he was always in search of using sort of as many human senses as possible to try and understand what the existence is kind of not even about, but maybe just dig deep to the roots of experience, human experience, cosmic experience. I mean, he himself wrote poems prefacing some of the pieces in order maybe to describe certain emotions, but I feel it works much better the other way around, because it's his music that evokes all these emotions. I think in my first recording, it was the second sonata where he describes 3 different types of sea, and I remember sometimes when playing it or when performing it, it's kind of starts almost smelling kind of this salty air of the ocean. I don't know what it is, but words have a very limited possibility when really describing anything. And of course, artists always try to express things in different way, almost bypassing the limitations of language. And in Scriabin's music, I think he does it unlike anyone I can think of. He doesn't try to describe the meaning of emotion. He goes beyond it. He is kind of reaching straight for it, so that you wouldn't need any words to describe it, if that makes sense.
Now I'm going to reach for yet another non-musical. I mean, it's sort of intoxicating. You feel heady listening to his music, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I mean, whether it's his use of harmony. I mean, one of the things, listening to the record that he seems to do is he seems to have a piece that's in a certain key, but avoids the tonic of that key. So you've got this kind of slightly unsettling feeling that you sort of know where you are, but he never actually helps you out. So you're in this weird and actually incredibly beautiful, perfumed sort of atmosphere.
Yeah, but you are talking about his later pieces, probably.
Yes, I am.
That is true. That is one of the aspects. I mean, it's especially the case, I guess, in the 10th sonata, and maybe there's a poem that is like this. It's where you feel that time loses its meaning and you just kind of hanging in the air. And to explain it technically, maybe it has to do something with not resolving, because he was quite obsessed to always continuing with the dominant. And this Promethean chord I was talking about, that many of his late pieces are based on, which is sort of based on force plus an augmented force, which is a triton, kind of almost reaching beyond the boundary, striving for something else, having that extra step. But it's in a way, maybe to understand, in my mind, sort of timelessness of just, people sometimes talk of achieving these spiritual states where you don't experience time anymore. And I think sometimes in his music, he does it quite clearly without having to take any, drugs or without having to maybe meditate for 2 hours every day. It's through music. Sometimes you listen to it, and if you open your mind and just after a while you realize this is all quite timeless and quite
although it's quite interesting that he wrote 10 piano sonatas, and it's interesting that a composer whose music, as you just said, sort of tries to sort of play around or almost denies time, should adopt a form. The sonata form is, there's a sort of logic to sonata form that almost imposes a form. But then again, within his sonatas, some might be a single movement, some might be 2 movements. There aren't actually that many that have the 4 movements, which is, I guess, a sort of traditional Beethovenian model, perhaps.
But if you think about it, it is a little bit like the world actually is. If you deconstruct it to basic elements, it's all atoms and structures. But from that, you create something unusual and unique. In a way, you can say maybe it's like similar like this with Scriabin's later works, where sort of the building blocks are very logical, but they then become sort of they take life of their own eventually and become something else. You also mentioned something about sometimes you are not certain where the music is going, and I think this kind of, especially with the 10th sonata, it can feel sometimes a little bit almost fragmented, because you have sort of elements on top of each other and it's not sometimes sure where they are going. And I think, as a pianist, he was also a little bit, apparently, according to the descriptions, we don't know, quite volatile pianist. And sort of sometimes with these small sort of fragmentations, you can sometimes lose the sense of the whole. But I never found that sort of a limitation. It doesn't distract me, because sometimes I feel the music demands it, and it feels quite organic.
Does his writing for the piano push piano technique, or is his advancing of musical language as a different, maybe harmonically led?
That's a good question.
He didn't have huge hands, did he? People sort of said that, he could barely do a ninth.
Yeah, he was generally quite a small person, actually. Often compare them to Yuri Gagarin, who was a kind of Russian astronaut who was very, very short. I can't remember, it was 5 foot something small, but I don't exactly know. But he was, so I think his hands would have been probably not. But you wouldn't have actually noticed that, because especially in the left hand, the stretches can be very big. And it was partly to do because his left hand was extremely developed. You probably know that he damaged his right hand when he was preparing for his exam, and then he had to write some pieces for the left hand, which is on this recording. And actually his left hand technique was incredible and remained incredible after this. So all his pieces incredibly taxing for the left hand. But I don't know, technique is not something I often think about. So I always feel it's kind of in service of what you are trying to do musically. And I think Scriabin's writing does require a certain flexibility, a certain type of technique. It's extremely pianistic, a little bit maybe similar to Chopin as well. And sort of the flexibility that the pieces require is incredibly comfortable, but also challenging at the same time. But yes, you mentioned harmony. Scriabin's harmony is, especially in his middle period, which is in fact my favorite, because it's before kind of the madness that's to come, and after the perhaps slightly less complex romantic ideas. So it's the middle period, which is kind of on the verge, neither here or there, has for me a lot to say, and that's where his writing is at his most complex, because the later pieces quite formulaic. Actually, for the brain, much easier to comprehend, but the middle periods is very hard to define and hard to grasp, kind of very slippery as well. So that as a performer gives you a certain freedom to explore and maybe dig in deeper directions. I don't know if you noticed, but that CD actually contains a lot of pieces from kind of his middle period, like the Fourth Sonata, the Fantasy, one of my favorite pieces. Fantasy has very complex writing, very counter-punctual at times, quite dense, sometimes fragmented, but can take off at any moment. So you don't know what to expect. It always surprises you.
And do you find when you immerse yourself in his music, so for sake of argument, this, when you're recording this album, you've got just a bit over an hour worth of music. I mean, is it an intoxicating or a extraordinary world to go into? Because in your note you convey this almost, he almost takes hold of you as a composer.
Yes, but that doesn't only happen with Scriabin. To be honest, when I record anything, I find myself intoxicated with any composer. The recording process itself is something quite special in general for me. I mean, when you spend several days, kind of 8 hours, trying to do your best take, you can become easily intoxicated with anything. But Scriabin in particular is already intoxicating, so it doesn't really require much to get you to the next level. But done it twice now. It's a very intense experience. But I don't know, because there is so much variety in the styles and in the pieces I choose, I never find myself tired. And actually the first recording we completed very quickly. It was done in less than 2 days, I think. Just came naturally. Sometimes if there are good takes, why bother doing more? I think this recording is quite a bit longer, also time-wise. I tried to fit in as much as possible. I would have loved to record even more. Yes, it was intense, but like I said, every recording, the actual process, I feel it does take my brain to the limit, some kind of a limit. I don't know what the limit is, because for 3 days, your brain is on a different level and acts differently. In a concert, that's not the same. It's over in 2 hours, and you are in that zone for just that amount of time. But if you prolong that, there were times I felt I pushed myself or my brain too far. I think especially that was the case with the Tchaikovsky recording, which was previous to this. The arrangement that I've done in the Romeo and Juliet is quite taxing, and I remember having to actually lie on the floor a couple of times. And it was actually Ruslan and Lyudmila where I just thought, my brain was spinning out of control when I was doing it. There's just so much going on. It's not just technically, but also musically, because you're kind of pretending to be a whole orchestra, or you are the whole orchestra in that case. Yeah, it sort of takes you to the limit, which is not quite the same in a concert. I mean, there's just limited time in a concert for performance. It's not the case in the recording. And every take has to be special. It's not that you just sit there and play. It has to kind of better and has to get I'm sure you know how it is.
I mean, I'm sure eagle-eyed people will look at your 2 Scriabin recordings and say he's now done 5 of the 10 sonatas. Can you see yourself ultimately scooping the rest up maybe over the next 20 years, because it's almost 20 years since you did the first album?
Yes, if there is demand for it, a wish for it, or if I feel I mean, I certainly feel it is not even just in the sonatas. I would like to ideally record all of Scriabin's piano music, because there's just so much in it. But no, there's still so many of the sonatas that I would like to record. It's certainly something that I would do. It's just maybe I said to you last time, I wish I had more lifetimes. Or maybe it was
Jean. I think it was when we were talking with Jean Flamme, and you were talking about Scriabin, and Jean Flamme is one of those completists, who basically said, well, but why don't you do them all?
Yes, that's true. Yeah, it's just I wish there were more lifetimes, because I think I said to you in the beginning, Scriabin wasn't a composer I was looking out for. It kind of found me in a way. I didn't realize I would feel so close to him, not only musically but also actually on a personal level. I mean, he was a crazy personality. Horowitz used to say he was completely everybody knew he was completely crazy, of course.
Does it reconnect you to your roots? Because obviously you've lived in the UK now for a very long time, but you were born in Russia, and there must be something in your DNA that must sort of take you back to, as it were, the old land. And, it's like when you hear a British orchestra play the music of Elgar, there's a kind of understanding there that almost you can't describe. And it must be, for a Russian-born pianist, there must be something playing Russian music that makes some connection.
Yeah, I mean, the question of identity is a complicated one, especially for me, because I moved out of Russia when I was only 10 and then lived in Germany, where I didn't particularly feel at home so much. So what connects me to Russia, yeah, maybe it is just music, because there's nothing else I can think of. But even Russian music is so diverse. I mean, it is really hard to categorize. I think in Scriabin's music, there's something more to it than kind of Russian identity. As I mentioned, there aren't any elements that make it distinctly Russian at all. It's more sort of universal language, just universal questions about, existence, about human experience, about torment, about love, about everything possible that a human can experience. Yes, I can relate to that more than maybe I can relate to Russia in a sense, because these are all questions that always fascinated me. And I don't think it's maybe the land in particular that draws me back. It's just the kind of looking for what human experience is about, is what kind of drives me, like all these questions.
And that must be one of the great things about being a musician, is that, you can be truly multilingual, as it were, because you can play anything.
Maybe, but one should remember that my job is actually not to understand it. my job is trying to translate all these things so that other people can experience them. So one of the things that perhaps is not so obvious to a listener is that the performer doesn't experience the same thing as the listener. My job is kind of to translate it. I'm almost like a vessel between the connection between the composer and the listener. So whether I understand all the mechanics or how it works doesn't really matter in the end, as long as it gets translated properly or the way I envision it. But to actually understand it more logically, I would actually have to think about it, which I do when I try to find out more about composers, when I write the notes and read their biographies. This is all very fascinating, and maybe how they perceive the world and what affected them, all these things. But as a performer, you don't need to do any of it, actually, as long as you have the ability to translate it properly.
But one of the fascinating things about that is, you could take 5 pianists and you could give them the same piece of music and you would get 5 completely different approaches to that music, even though in theory everything should be there on the page, but actually it's not.
Well, I hope so. It would be different. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any need for any of us. But also, that's the great thing about it, of course. Yeah, that's what interpretation is, and what makes us relevant to some extent.
And it's what makes people go back constantly to the concert hall to sit through the gazillionth performance of the Eroica. You go into the concert hall, knowing that the Eroica will sound different every single time. And that's kind of one of the wonderful things about classical music.
Yes. As I was saying, I don't feel I need to know everything about the composer as a person in order to understand what's in the music. For me, actually, the less written in the score, the better. That's why I liked so much Scarlatti, because written for the harpsichord. There's no dynamic, no indications, no nothing, just the notes. Sometimes I find it easier, to be honest. It kind of gets rid of all the distraction, and you try to understand what the actual essence is, what the composer wanted to say, kind of on an emotional level, again, which you can use as many adjectives as possible. You'll never be able to describe. And that's why you get different interpretations. So you kind of get into it on a different level just by... I don't know exactly. If I knew how to describe it, I guess it would be very straightforward. But being stripped of all these distractions, just focus on what the composer tried to say, is what I always felt most natural for me. The rest, educating myself about the circumstances under which the piece was written, or maybe the time in the country, what was happening politically, all these things are incredibly interesting, but don't particularly feel they enhance my ability to understand what the composer tried to say on a musical level. That might be the case more with other composers, where that might be more relevant, but somebody like Scriabin, who goes really down deep to the absolute raw elements, I don't think that is necessary for me to know everything, if that makes sense.
Part of Scriabin's Prelude Opus 16 No. 3, it was played by Yevgeny Sudbin on his new Bis album, just out. It marks his 25th release for the label and is the recipient of an enthusiastic review in the forthcoming June issue of Gramophone, due out in a couple of weeks. Gramophone podcasts are free, so if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone Magazine. Over 13 issues a year, we bring you hundreds of reviews by our expert critics, as well as in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases and the most exciting musicians of the day. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support. And do consider leaving a review or rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And do look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.